There is a silence in the deep Australian outback that you cannot find anywhere else on Earth. It is not a peaceful silence. It is heavy. It is the sound of an ancient landscape that has survived for hundreds of millions of years by being absolutely, uncompromisingly unforgiving. If you drive straight into the dead center of the continent, the flat, scrubby desert stretches out in every direction until the curvature of the Earth bends it out of sight. And then, suddenly, rising 348 meters out of the red dirt, is Uluru. In 1980, white Australia still called it Ayers Rock. For the local Anangu Aboriginal people, it is a site of immense spiritual gravity, a sacred monument woven into their creation times. But by the late 20th century, it had become something else entirely to the rest of the country. A postcard, a tourist playground. Families from the coastal cities would pack their station wagons, drive for days across the sun-blasted highways, and pitch canvas tents at the base of the rock. They brought with them sausages for the public barbecues, cans of warm beer, and an ingrained, dangerous arrogance. They looked at the lethal Australian desert and saw a petting zoo. They fed the wild dingoes that scavenged around the campsites. They took photos of their toddlers standing next to apex predators. They believed that because they were on a family holiday, the rules of nature had been suspended. On the night of August 17, 1980, the rules of nature reasserted themselves. A mother's frantic, guttural cry pierced the cold desert air. "A dingo's got my baby!" What followed was not just a tragedy, it was a national witch hunt, a catastrophic failure of the justice system, a total collapse of forensic science, and a brutal, terrifying exposure of how the media, the police, and the public can collectively decide a woman is guilty of murder simply because she does not cry the way they want her to. Today, we begin a 4-part journey back to the red dirt of the Northern Territory. We are going to look at the death of 9-week-old Azaria Chamberlain through the tunnel vision of the police, the flawed microscopes of the experts, and the blinding glare of a furious public. This is false fiction, and this is the story of a baby taken by the wild and a family torn apart by the civilized. To understand why the Chamberlain family became the perfect target for a national hysteria, you first have to understand who they were before the nightmare began. In August of 1980, Michael and Lindy Chamberlain lived in Mount Isa, a rough, remote mining town in outback Queensland. They were not your typical beer-drinking, rough-and-tumble outback Australians. Michael was a 36-year-old pastor in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He was a deeply earnest, softly spoken man who took his faith with absolute seriousness. Lindy, at 32, was the anchor of the family. She was pragmatic, highly organized, and possessed an intense, unyielding fortitude. If something needed doing, Lindy did it. She made her own clothes, she managed the household finances, she did not suffer fools, and she rarely displayed vulnerability. In her faith, the world was ordered by God's will. You did not question it, you endured it. They had 2 young sons, Aidan, aged 6, and Reagan, aged 4. And in June of 1980, they welcomed their 3rd child, a beautiful, bright-eyed baby girl. They named her Azaria. Let's pause on that name, Azaria. It is a beautiful, ancient Hebrew name. It translates directly to blessed of God or helped by God. But keep that name in the back of your mind, because within a few weeks, the Australian media would completely invent a new translation for it, a lie that would help send a mother to prison. In mid-August, Michael had a few weeks of leave, and the family decided to take a camping trip to the Red Centre. They packed their bright yellow 1977 Holden Torana hatchback, a quintessential, boxy Australian car that would soon become the most scrutinised vehicle in the history of the nation's legal system. They drove westward, crossing the invisible border into the Northern Territory. The Torana was packed tight. Tents, sleeping bags, a portable bassinet for the baby, and Michael's camera gear. He was an avid amateur photographer, obsessed with capturing the ancient landscape. When they arrived at the Ayers Rock campground on the afternoon of August 16th, they found a site buzzing with tourists. The campground wasn't some remote, isolated patch of dirt. It was highly populated. There were communal shower blocks, public barbecues built from brick, and dozens of tents and caravans clustered together under the sparse shade of desert oaks. Lindy and Michael set up their tent just 20 meters away from the main barbecue area. For the tourists, the dingoes were a novelty. They looked like lean, sandy-colored domestic dogs. People were throwing them scraps of sausage. Children were trying to pet them. But the local park rangers knew better. For months leading up to August 1980, the rangers had been writing increasingly frantic memos to the Northern Territory Conservation Commission. The dingoes were losing their fear of humans. They were becoming aggressive. A few weeks prior, a dingo had bitten a young girl at the campsite, requiring stitches. Another had dragged a pillow out of a tent while a tourist was sleeping on it. The rangers begged for permission to cull the aggressive animals. The government bureaucrats in the city, worried about public relations and tourist optics, told them to hold off. Lindy Chamberlain didn't trust the animals. She kept her children close, but she was surrounded by hundreds of other people. She felt safe in the crowd. On Sunday, August 17th, 1980, the day had been beautiful. The family had hiked around the base of the rock. Michael had taken rolls of film, including a photograph of baby Azaria sitting in Lindy's lap, wearing a black dress Lindy had sewn herself. That photograph would later be weaponized by the press as evidence of occult behavior, simply because the baby was wearing black. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted, as it does in the deep desert. It dropped toward freezing. At 7:45 p.m., the campground was dark, illuminated only by the glow of the barbecue fires and the harsh, swinging beams of flashlights. Lindy and Michael were cooking dinner at the communal barbecue, chatting with another family they had met, the Lows. Azaria, who was 9 weeks old, had fallen asleep in Lindy's arms. Lindy decided to put her to bed. Let's walk through the timeline, minute by minute, because every single second of this night would eventually be dissected in 4 separate courtrooms over 32 years. Lindy carried Azaria back to the tent. The baby was dressed in a terry toweling jumpsuit, a diaper, a singlet, and, crucially, a white knitted matinee jacket with a pale lemon edging, which Lindy had placed over the baby to keep the bitter desert cold out. Lindy walked the 20 meters to the tent. Inside, 4-year-old Reagan was already fast asleep in his sleeping bag. Lindy placed the sleeping baby Azaria into a portable bassinet, which was resting on the floor of the tent beside Reagan. She tucked the blankets around her. Lindy backed out of the tent. She zipped the canvas flap down, but she didn't zip it entirely closed. The zipper was sticky, and she left a small gap at the bottom, maybe 4 or 5 inches, just enough to let the stale air out. She walked back to the barbecue. She sat next to her husband, Michael. She began to eat a can of baked beans. It is now 8 p.m. A sharp, sudden cry rang out through the cold air. It wasn't a sustained wail. It was a single, abrupt, urgent cry of a baby, abruptly cut off. Michael Chamberlain paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He turned to his wife. That was the baby. Lindy stood up. She wasn't panicked yet. Babies wake up. Babies cry. She began walking the 20 meters back to the tent. The lighting was terrible, just the ambient glow from the distant fires and the stars overhead. As she closed the distance, her eyes adjusted to the shadows. She saw something moving near the entrance of her tent. It was a dingo. It had its head down, backing out through the flap of the canvas. In the dim light, Lindy saw it violently shaking its head, the way a dog shakes a toy. It had something clamped in its jaws, but the light was too poor to see what it was. Lindy shouted at the animal, "Get out of there!" The dingo dropped its head, turned, and bolted silently into the dark spinifex grass. Lindy reached the tent. She expected to see Azaria crying in her bassinet, perhaps frightened by the animal brushing past the canvas. She unzipped the tent fully and stepped inside. The blankets in the bassinet were scattered. There were a few small, dark spots on the adjacent sleeping bag. The bassinet was empty. Reagan was still asleep next to it, completely unharmed. But Azaria was gone. Lindy Chamberlain backed out of the tent. She drew in a breath of the freezing desert air, and then she let out a scream that stopped the entire campground dead.
"Michael! Michael! A dingo's got my baby!"
Chaos erupted. Within 60 seconds, the Lows and Michael were at the tent. Within 5 minutes, dozens of tourists had abandoned their dinners and grabbed flashlights. Within 10 minutes, 300 people were crashing through the dense, thorny outback scrub, sweeping their lights wildly into the dark. Imagine the sheer terror of that moment. A 9-week-old infant, weighing just under 10 pounds, out in the freezing desert, in the jaws of an apex predator. People were crying. Men were shouting Azaria's name into the wind, a futile gesture, but human instinct demands action. Tourists angled their cars toward the scrub and turned their high beams on, trying to illuminate the desert floor. The local police arrived shortly after. And this is where the first tragic mistake of the investigation occurred. In their desperation to find the child, the tourists and the police trampled the crime scene. Hundreds of heavy boots crushed the sand around the tent, obliterating delicate footprints. But not all of them. The police knew they were out of their depth in the bush at night. They called in the true experts of the landscape, the Aboriginal trackers. Nipper Winmarty, a senior Anangu tracker, arrived at the campsite. While the police officers and tourists were rushing blindly into the dark, Nipper moved slowly. He looked at the sand with a flashlight held at a low angle to catch the shadows of the indentations. He found exactly what Lindy Chamberlain said had happened. Nipper found the distinct, fresh paw prints of a single dingo leading directly up to the tent flap. He found the prints of the animal inside the tent. He found where it had backed out, and then he found something that chilled the blood of everyone who saw it. Leading away from the tent, alongside the dingo tracks, was a continuous, shallow depression in the sand, a drag mark. The animal was carrying something heavy, and a portion of it was dragging on the ground. A few meters away, a tourist named Wally Goodwin found a small puddle of fresh blood in the sand. Further along the trail, caught on the sharp thorns of a bush, the trackers found a small, woven thread. It perfectly matched the blanket that Azaria had been wrapped in. The trackers followed the trail deep into the night. They tracked it over sand dunes, through the scrub, until it reached a hard, rocky outcrop at the base of Uluru. There, on the solid stone, the tracks vanished. To Nipper Winmarty and the other Aboriginal trackers, the story was written in the earth as clearly as a printed book. A dingo had entered the tent, taken the child by the head, carried her across the sand, and disappeared into the rocks. To them, there was absolutely no mystery. It was a tragedy of the natural world. But to the Northern Territory Police, a predominantly white, urban force operating out of Alice Springs and Darwin, the narrative didn't sit right. The police officers standing in the dark that night had a very specific, flawed view of dingoes. They believed they were cowardly scavengers. They ate garbage. They stole sausages. The idea that a 30-pound wild dog could enter a tent, bypass a sleeping 4-year-old boy, pick up a 10-pound baby, and carry it for miles without dropping it. It seemed preposterous to them. Furthermore, they were looking at Lindy Chamberlain. As the hours ticked by and the temperature dropped below zero, the shock set in. Lindy wasn't wailing. She wasn't tearing her hair out. She was sitting in a police car, answering questions with a flat, pragmatic tone. Her faith told her that if Azaria was dead, she was resting, and she would see her again in the resurrection. She was holding her grief inside a deeply disciplined, religious armor. The police didn't understand her faith. They didn't understand her demeanor, and because they didn't understand her, they immediately began to suspect her. As the sun began to rise over Uluru on the morning of August 18th, painting the massive rock a brilliant, bloody red, the searchers were exhausted. They hadn't found the baby. They hadn't found the dingo. But the seed of doubt had been planted in the minds of the detectives. They began to wonder if the monster they were looking for wasn't hiding in the rocky caves of the outback. They began to wonder if the monster was sitting right in front of them, wearing a mother's clothes. When a child vanishes into the wild, the first few hours are defined by pure adrenaline-fueled terror. But when the sun comes up and the child is still gone, the terror metamorphoses into something else. It becomes an agonizing, hollow silence. For 7 days following the night of August 17, 1980, that silence hung over the base of Uluru. The massive search parties of tourists had packed up their tents and driven home. The Aboriginal trackers had followed the dingo prints as far as the hard rock would allow, but eventually the trail evaporated. Lindy and Michael Chamberlain were placed in a motel in Alice Springs, sedated by doctors, waiting for a phone call they knew, in their hearts, would not bring good news. They understood the brutal reality of the Australian desert. A 9-week-old baby could not survive a freezing outback night, let alone an attack by an apex predator. But the Northern Territory Police were not operating on the assumption of a wild animal attack. They were operating on a growing, unspoken suspicion. They couldn't fathom a dog carrying a baby for miles. They looked at Lindy Chamberlain's dry eyes and flat voice, and they began to whisper. Then, exactly 1 week after Azaria disappeared, the desert finally gave something back. And in doing so, it set off a chain reaction of forensic destruction and media hysteria that would tear the nation in two. It is Sunday, August 24th. A tourist named Wallace Goodwin is taking a walk around the western base of Uluru. He is an avid hiker, pushing through the thick scrub and navigating the boulders far off the designated tourist paths. This specific area is known to the local rangers as heavily populated by dingo dens. As Goodwin climbs near a rocky outcrop, something catches his eye. Lying in the dirt near a small boulder is a bundle of cloth. He approaches it. It is a tiny, blood-stained, terry-toweling jumpsuit, a diaper, and a singlet. Goodwin knows instantly what he has found. He doesn't touch it. He immediately alerts the authorities. Let's freeze this moment in time. In modern forensic science, finding the clothing of a victim is the holy grail. The clothing is a three-dimensional map of the crime. How it is torn, how the blood dried on the fabric, whether there is animal saliva, human DNA, or specific drag patterns. All of this information is locked inside the geometry of how that garment sits in the dirt. You secure the perimeter. You photograph it from 100 angles. You bring in forensic biologists to gently lift it. But this was 1980, in the remote outback of the Northern Territory. When the local police officers arrived at the scene, they didn't treat it like a delicate puzzle. They treated it like lost luggage. A police officer walked up to the clothes, picked them up with his bare hands, folded them together, and shoved them into a standard plastic bag. In that single, careless motion, the police destroyed the most critical evidence of the entire case. By folding the blood-soaked fabric and stuffing it into a bag, the dried blood flaked off, and wet blood transferred to different parts of the jumpsuit. The orientation of the tears was ruined. Any fragile animal hairs or saliva on the collar were aggressively rubbed against the plastic. But there was another, even more massive problem when the police laid the clothes out on an examination table back at the station. The jumpsuit was there. The diaper was there. The singlet was there. But the white knitted matinee jacket with the pale lemon edging, the jacket Lindy fiercely insisted she had zipped over the baby to keep her warm, was completely missing. The police looked at the jumpsuit. The neck collar was torn, and it was mostly undone, unclasped from the top down. To a seasoned tracker, or anyone who knows wild animals, an animal like a dingo, eating its prey, will often peel back clothing, essentially turning it inside out as it pulls the meat from the fabric. But to the Northern Territory detectives, The unclasped buttons didn't look like an animal's frantic tearing. It looked deliberate. It looked like human hands had undressed the baby, and they believed that the missing matinee jacket was a deliberate lie. Why would Lindy lie about a jacket? The police formed a theory. Lindy invented the jacket to explain why there wouldn't be massive amounts of dingo saliva directly on the jumpsuit. If the jacket never existed, then the lack of saliva proved the dingo never existed. The police stopped looking for a wild dog. They started building a murder case. To understand the persecution of Lindy Chamberlain, you have to look at the power of the television camera. The Chamberlain case was Australia's first true trial by media. It dominated the evening news every single night. The press descended on Lindy and Michael, shoving microphones into their faces as they walked to their car, camping outside their home, analysing every syllable they spoke. The public was waiting for a performance. They wanted Lindy to play the role of the weeping, shattered mother. They wanted her to be sedated, held up by her husband, unable to speak. Instead, Lindy Chamberlain walked out of her home wearing large sunglasses, her hair perfectly styled, wearing a bright floral dress. When a reporter asked her how a dingo could have taken the baby, Lindy didn't collapse in tears. She answered analytically. She held up her hands to demonstrate the size of a dingo's jaws, explaining the mechanics of how it could crush an infant's skull. The public, watching from their living rooms, recoiled in horror. "She's too cold," they whispered at the water coolers. "She's not crying. Mothers don't act like that. She's acting like she's explaining a recipe, not the death of her baby." What the public didn't understand was the profound psychological armor of shock, compounded by Lindy's deep religious convictions. Seventh-day Adventists believe in the sleep of the dead, that the deceased are entirely unconscious until the second coming of Christ, when they will be resurrected whole and perfect. To Lindy, crying hysterically meant doubting God's plan. Azaria was safe. She was sleeping. But mainstream Australia in the 1980s knew very little about Seventh-day Adventists. Ignorance breeds fear, and fear demands a villain. Within weeks, the rumour mill mutated into pure, hysterical mythology. The rumours weren't just whispered, they were published as semi-factual gossip in tabloids across the country. A rumour swept the nation that the name Azaria did not mean blessed of God, but rather meant sacrifice in the wilderness. Despite local librarians and religious scholars publicly debunking this, the public latched onto it as proof that the child was bred for a ritual killing. The witchcraft allegations, the black dress. The media published Michael's photograph of baby Azaria wearing a black dress that Lindy had sewn. In the 1980s, infants wore pastels, pink, yellow, blue. Black was seen as morbid, occult, and sinister. Tabloids heavily implied the family was part of a fringe death cult. The Bloody Book, the Bible incident. A rumor circulated that police found a children's Bible in the Chamberlain's tent, heavily stained with blood, bookmarked to a passage about child sacrifice. The truth? A child's book was found in the car, and it had a single, tiny smudge of jam on it. The entire nation formed a terrifying cognitive dissonance. It was psychologically easier for the Australian public to believe that a mother was an occult-worshipping, cold-blooded murderer than it was to accept that a wild animal could snatch a baby from a family campsite while people were cooking dinner. If it was a dingo, it meant nature was unpredictable and no one was safe. If it was a murderous mother, then the threat was isolated. The world made sense again. Lindy Chamberlain was no longer a victim. In the eyes of the public, she was a witch. And the Northern Territory Police were determined to burn her at the stake. By December 1980, the tension was at a breaking point. The Northern Territory convened a coronial inquest to officially determine the cause of Azaria Chamberlain's death. The inquest was held in Alice Springs, presided over by Coroner Dennis Barrett. The police arrived at the inquest confident. They presented their theory. Lindy had taken the baby into the Turana, murdered her, disposed of the body, and faked the dingo attack. But Coroner Barrett was a man of evidence, not rumor. He listened to the police, and then he listened to the people the police had ignored. He listened to Nipper Winmati and the Aboriginal trackers. He looked at the photographs of the dingo tracks entering the tent. He looked at the drag marks. He brought in experts on wild dog behavior who testified that, yes, a hungry, habituated dingo is more than capable of taking a 10-pound infant. Barrett looked at the police's handling of the jumpsuit and heavily criticized their forensic destruction of the clothes. He noted that the tears on the fabric, while difficult to interpret because of police mishandling, were consistent with an animal's teeth. On February 20th, 1981, Coroner Dennis Barrett prepared to deliver his findings. In an unprecedented move in Australian legal history, he ordered that the courtroom proceedings be broadcast live on national television. He knew the whole country was watching, and he knew the Chamberlains had been subjected to a merciless public execution. Coroner Barrett looked directly into the television cameras. He officially found that Azaria Chamberlain had met her death by being attacked and taken by a wild dingo. But he didn't stop there. He looked over the bench at Lindy and Michael Chamberlain, who were sitting quietly in the gallery. His voice trembled with genuine empathy. He said, "You have not only suffered the loss of your beloved child in the most tragic of circumstances, but you have all been subjected to months of innuendo, suspicion, and malicious gossip. The name Azaria does not mean sacrifice in the wilderness. You are not part of a weird religious cult. I express the hope that with the ending of this inquest, you will be allowed to rebuild your lives in peace." For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like the nightmare was over. The justice system had worked. A sensible judge had seen through the media fog and cleared an innocent family. Lindy and Michael walked out of the courthouse, holding hands, believing the worst chapter of their lives had finally closed. But they underestimated the pride of the Northern Territory police force. The police were utterly humiliated. They had just been dressed down on national television. Their competence had been mocked. To them, Coroner Barrett was a fool who had been duped by a cold, calculating woman. The detectives retreated to their headquarters. They decided that if the current evidence didn't point to murder, they just needed to look harder. They needed better science. They needed experts who would tell them exactly what they wanted to hear. In secret, the Northern Territory Police launched Operation Ochre, a covert mission designed entirely to build a murder case against Lindy Chamberlain. They seized the family's yellow Tirana. They stripped it down to its bare metal chassis. They cut out the carpets. They removed the seats. They sent the ruined jumpsuit on a plane to a prestigious laboratory in London. They were going to replace the clear, undeniable tracks in the sand with the microscopic, subjective world of chemical reagents and UV lights. They were about to unleash an era of junk science that would seal a mother's fate and plunge the Australian legal system into its darkest decade. There is a dangerous illusion in modern society, the belief that science is completely objective. We like to think that a man in a white lab coat, staring through a microscope, is immune to the messy, emotional prejudices of the outside world. But science is conducted by human beings, and human beings are susceptible to the most dangerous psychological trap of all: confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is what happens when you decide what the truth is before you begin your experiment. You stop looking for evidence to find the answer. Instead, you only look for evidence that proves you were right all along. By mid-1981, the Northern Territory Police Force had made their decision. Lindy Chamberlain was a murderer. Coroner Dennis Barrett had humiliated them by clearing her name on national television, citing the clear tracks of a wild dingo in the red sand. The police realized that they could not win the case out in the vast, uncontrollable Australian desert. The desert had spoken, and it said Lindy was innocent. So, the detectives decided to move the battlefield. They shrank the universe of the investigation down from the massive expanse of Uluru to the microscopic slide of a Petri dish. They were going to use forensic science to put a grieving mother behind bars. And to do it, they were going to rely on experts who would look at car paint and see a baby's blood, and look at the frayed edge of a jumpsuit and see a pair of scissors. Welcome to the darkest era of Australian jurisprudence. In late 1981, the police packaged up Azaria's ruined, blood-stained jumpsuit, the same jumpsuit they had haphazardly shoved into a plastic bag, and flew it to London. They delivered it to Professor James Cameron, a highly prestigious forensic odontologist, a bite mark expert. Professor Cameron was a star in the forensic world. He had a booming voice, undeniable authority, and a terrifying track record of being completely, catastrophically wrong. Years later, his testimony would be exposed as the driving force behind several wrongful convictions in the UK. But in 1981, his word was considered the gospel truth. Cameron examined the torn collar of the jumpsuit. Now remember, police had folded the wet, bloody fabric upon itself. When blood dries and is then pulled apart, the fabric tears in jagged, unnatural ways. But Cameron didn't factor this in. He testified that the tears around the neck of the jumpsuit were not caused by the carnassial teeth of a canine. He stated with absolute certainty that the fabric had been cleanly cut with a pair of scissors. But Cameron wasn't done. He placed the jumpsuit under an ultraviolet light. Under the eerie purple glow of the UV light, Cameron claimed he saw something horrifying. He told the police that the bloodstains on the front of the jumpsuit formed the perfect, distinct imprint of a small adult hand. 4 fingers and a thumb pressing down into the fabric. Lindy Chamberlain's hand. The police were ecstatic. The London expert had just handed them their murder weapon, the scissors, and the mother's bloody signature on the victim's clothing. But the handprint was a phantom. It was pareidolia, the psychological phenomenon where the human brain sees recognizable shapes in random patterns, like seeing a face in a cloud. The fingers were just the folds of the fabric where the wet blood had pooled together inside the police evidence bag. But it didn't matter. The police had their headline. Now, they just needed a crime scene. If Lindy cut Azaria's throat with scissors, she had to have done it somewhere. The tent was virtually clean. The sleeping bag only had a few small spots of blood, consistent with a baby bleeding from a head wound as an animal dragged it away. So, the police turned to the family's car, the yellow 1977 Holden Torana hatchback. Under the banner of Operation Ochre, police seized the vehicle. They dismantled it piece by piece. They ripped out the carpets, removed the seats, and swabbed every millimeter of the chassis. To analyze these swabs, they brought in Joy Cool, a forensic biologist from the Department of Health in Sydney. Joy Cool was about to make the most devastating scientific error in Australian history. She used a screening chemical called the orthotolidine test. It is a presumptive test for blood. When you drop this chemical onto a swab, if it turns a bright, vivid blue, it indicates the presence of hemoglobin. Cool swabbed the area under the passenger side dashboard, right where Lindy Chamberlain's legs would have been if she was sitting in the front seat. Cool dropped the chemical. The swabs turned brilliantly, blindingly blue. Joy Cool went to the police and claimed she had found an arterial spray pattern of blood under the dashboard. Even more damning, she claimed she ran further tests that proved this wasn't just any blood. It was saturated with fetal hemoglobin, a specific type of oxygen-carrying protein found only in infants under 6 months old. The slit throat theory, the prosecution's narrative. Armed with Cool's findings, the police finalized their narrative. Lindy Chamberlain took Azaria from the tent, carried her to the front passenger seat of the Torana, and slit her throat. The baby's blood sprayed under the dashboard. Lindy then hid the body in Michael's camera bag, went back to the barbecue, and faked the dingo cry. It was a terrifying, airtight narrative. The media published Cool's findings with absolute glee. "Fetal blood found in car," screamed the front pages. There was only one problem. It wasn't blood. The orthotolidine test is famously sensitive, but it is deeply flawed. It is known to produce false positives when it interacts with certain other compounds. Specifically, it reacts to copper dust. It reacts to certain plant peroxidases. And, tragically, it reacts perfectly to distort, an industrial chemical emulsion sprayed into the wheel wells and undercarriages of cars at the Holden manufacturing plant to dampen road noise. The yellow Tirana was coated in it. Joy Cool didn't find the arterial spray of a murdered infant. She found car paint and sound deadener. The fetal hemoglobin was actually the result of the chemical breaking down over time and mimicking the protein structure in Cool's flawed testing tubes. But in late 1981, nobody questioned the forensic biologist. The police immediately petitioned the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory to quash Coroner Barrett's original findings. A second inquest was held. This time, the police presented their science. The coroner, overwhelmed by the confident testimony of Professor Cameron and Joy Cool, reversed the original decision. Lindy Chamberlain was formally charged with the murder of her 9-week-old daughter. Michael Chamberlain was charged as an accessory after the fact. September 13, 1982, the Supreme Court in Darwin. The trial of the century begins. Lindy Chamberlain walks into the courtroom. She is pale, exhausted, and visibly heavily pregnant with her 4th child. But she refuses to weep for the cameras. She holds her head high, gripping Michael's hand. To her supporters, it is a display of incredible Christian fortitude. To the hostile jury, it looks like the icy detachment of a psychopath. The prosecution was led by Ian Barker, Queen's Counsel. Barker was a theatrical, ruthless, and brilliant orator. He didn't just present the flawed forensic evidence, he mocked the very idea of a dingo attack. Barker painted Lindy as a cold, calculating liar. He brought Professor Cameron to the stand, who confidently pointed to the bloody handprint and the scissor cuts. He brought Joy Cool to the stand, who swore under oath that the yellow Tirana was a slaughterhouse of fetal blood. The defense fought back desperately. They brought in their own experts who argued the blood was actually sound deadener. They brought in Aboriginal trackers who reiterated the dingo prints. But Ian Barker had a trump card. He understood the psychology of the jury. He knew that to convict Lindy, he had to destroy her credibility completely. He focused his entire cross-examination on a single missing piece of fabric: the white knitted matinee jacket. Lindy testified over and over that Azaria was wearing the jacket over her jumpsuit. She explained that this was why the jumpsuit didn't have massive amounts of dingo saliva or hair on it. The jacket took the brunt of the animal's jaws. Ian Barker paced the courtroom floor. He turned to Lindy in the witness box and scoffed. "There was no matinee jacket, Mrs. Chamberlain, was there?" he sneered. Lindy stared back at him, her voice unwavering. "Yes, there was." Barker turned to the jury. "The matinee jacket is a fanciful lie. It is a desperate invention by a guilty woman trying to explain away the lack of animal saliva on her victim's clothes. No jacket was found because no jacket existed, and no dingo existed." The defense begged the jury to look at the lack of motive. Why would a loving, deeply religious mother with 2 happy sons suddenly slit the throat of her newborn daughter on a family camping trip? Where was the murder weapon? Where was the body? But Barker told the jury they didn't need a motive. They just needed the science. On October 29, 1982, after 6.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The foreman stood up. The silence in the room was absolute. "We find the accused, Alice Lynn Chamberlain, guilty." Lindy closed her eyes. Michael slumped in his chair, putting his head between his knees, weeping openly. Outside the courthouse, a massive crowd had gathered. When the guilty verdict was broadcast over the radios, a cheer went up. People clapped. Strangers hugged each other in the streets of Darwin. The witch had been slain. The monster was going to be locked away. The universe made sense again. The judge sentenced Lindy Chamberlain to life imprisonment with hard labor. Michael was given an 18-month suspended sentence for being an accessory, allowing him to stay out of prison to care for their 2 young boys, Aidan and Reagan. A heavily pregnant Lindy was placed in the back of a police van and driven to Berrima Prison, a harsh, sweltering concrete fortress in the tropical heat of the Northern Territory. A few weeks later, behind the high barbed wire fences, she went into labor. She gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Kalia. Under the cold, fluorescent lights of the prison hospital, Lindy was allowed to hold her newborn daughter for just a few precious hours. Then, a social worker walked into the room, gently took Kalia from Lindy's arms, and handed the baby over to foster parents. Lindy was escorted back to her concrete cell. The heavy steel door slammed shut. The Australian public went to sleep that night feeling safe. The justice system had worked. Science had prevailed over superstition. The police had cracked the case. But out in the desert, 300 miles away, the red dirt of Uluru kept a secret. Buried in the sand, hidden among the boulders and the spinifex grass, a piece of white knitted fabric lay waiting. It would take years, it would take another tragedy, but the desert was finally preparing to speak again. And when it did, it would bring the entire Australian legal system crashing to its knees. Time moves differently when you are locked in a concrete box for a crime you did not commit. Outside the barbed wire of Berrima prison, the world spun on. The 1980s marched forward. Politicians won and lost elections. Children grew up. But inside, Lindy Chamberlain was frozen in amber. By early 1986, she had spent over 1,000 days and nights in a maximum security cell in the sweltering tropical heat of Darwin. She had missed the formative years of her sons, Aidan and Reagan. She had been forced to hand her newborn daughter, Kalia, over to foster parents just hours after giving birth. She had exhausted her appeals. In 1984, the High Court of Australia, the highest legal authority in the land, upheld her life sentence in a split decision. The legal avenues were closed. The Northern Territory Police had won. Ian Barker, the charismatic prosecutor who had mocked her on the stand, had won. The public consensus had hardened into historical fact. Lindy Chamberlain was a cold-blooded killer. But out in the vast, red center of the continent, the desert does not care about police press conferences, Supreme Court verdicts, or public opinion. The desert only knows the truth. And for 6 years, it had been guarding the one piece of evidence that could bring the entire Australian legal system crashing to its knees. It would take a second terrible tragedy, a fatal misstep by a stranger, to finally force the desert to give up its secret. Uluru is not just a rock. It is a monolith with sheer, terrifying drops. Despite the warnings of the local Anangu people, who consider climbing the rock deeply disrespectful and highly dangerous, thousands of tourists climbed its steep, wind-battered face every year. In late January 1986, a 39-year-old British tourist named David Brett decided to make the climb. Brett was seeking spiritual enlightenment, but he chose an evening when the rock was practically deserted. Somewhere along the treacherous, uneven path, he lost his footing. He fell roughly 25 meters down the sheer sandstone face, hitting the rock ledges before coming to rest in a deeply secluded, boulder-strewn gorge at the western base of Uluru. When Brett was reported missing, local police and rangers launched a massive search. 8 days later, on February 2nd, 1986, searchers navigating the jagged, dangerous terrain finally spotted his body. The area where Brett fell was one of the most inaccessible parts of the monolith. It was a labyrinth of shadows, spinifex grass, and deep, dark crevices. Crucially, it was an area the rangers knew well for another reason entirely. It was a highly populated network of dingo lairs. As the police recovery team worked to retrieve Brett's remains, they noticed that wild animals had disturbed the area. The detectives began meticulously searching the surrounding dirt and caves to recover any missing personal items belonging to the fallen climber. A local police officer peered into the dark mouth of a nearby dingo den. The entrance was choked with dry grass and red sand. He got down on his hands and knees and began to dig through the loose dirt. His fingers brushed against something soft. It wasn't a piece of climbing gear. It was fabric. He pulled it out of the sand and held it up to the harsh outback sun. It was a tiny, knitted piece of clothing. It was filthy, weathered by 6 years of desert sun, rain, and wind. It was stiff with dirt, but the color was unmistakable. It was white, with a pale lemon edging. The neck of the garment was frayed and torn. The police officer stared at it. Every law enforcement official in the Northern Territory knew the law of the Chamberlain case. They all knew the famous words of prosecutor Ian Barker echoing in the Supreme Court. The matinee jacket is a fanciful lie. It is a desperate invention by a guilty woman. The officer was holding the fanciful lie in his hands. The realization hit the Northern Territory police force like a physical blow. If the matinee jacket was real, then Lindy had told the truth about what Azaria was wearing. If the jacket was real, it explained why there was so little dingo saliva on the jumpsuit underneath it. If the jacket was found exactly where the Aboriginal trackers had traced the dingo 6 years prior, then the dingo was real. And if the dingo was real, the fetal blood in the car, the bloody handprint under the UV light, and the scissor cuts were all catastrophic, terrifying illusions. For a few days, the Northern Territory government panicked. They tried to keep the discovery quiet, terrified of the unprecedented legal and political fallout. But you cannot keep a secret that massive buried for long. A journalist caught wind of the discovery, and the story exploded across the front pages of every newspaper in the country. The jacket is found. The public whiplash was absolute. The same media outlets that had branded Lindy a witch were suddenly demanding her release. The political pressure on the Northern Territory government became unbearable. On February 7, 1986, just 5 days after the jacket was pulled from the dirt, the government caved. They remitted Lindy Chamberlain's life sentence. The gates of Berrima prison opened. Lindy Chamberlain walked out into the blinding tropical sunlight. She was 37 years old. She wore a simple dress and dark sunglasses. Her face was a mask of hardened stone. She did not smile. She did not wave to the cheering crowds. The system that had stolen her youth, her baby, and her freedom was now patting itself on the back for letting her go. Lindy climbed into the back of a waiting car, reunited with Michael, and drove away from the concrete fortress. But release is not the same as exoneration. A remission of a sentence simply means the government is letting you out of prison early. It does not mean they are admitting they were wrong. On paper, Lindy Chamberlain was still a convicted child murderer. Lindy and Michael knew that stepping out of prison was only half the battle. Now, they had to put the science on trial. In 1987, the Australian government convened a royal commission, the highest form of public inquiry in the nation, headed by Justice Trevor Morling. Its sole purpose was to review the entirety of the forensic evidence used to convict the Chamberlains. This was the reckoning. This was the moment the junk science of the 1980s was finally dragged out of the dark and put under a clean, unbiased microscope. Justice Morling did what the original jury was never allowed to do. He listened to independent, international experts. He brought in acoustic engineers, textile specialists, and biologists who had no vested interest in protecting the pride of the Northern Territory Police. Over the course of months, Justice Morling systematically dismantled the prosecution's case, piece by piece. 1. The blood in the car. The biologist's error. The Royal Commission brought in independent chemists to test the so-called fetal blood, Joy Cool found in the Tirana. Using advanced testing Cool had ignored, they proved Cool's orthotolidine test had triggered a false positive. The spray pattern wasn't blood, it was distort, a sound-deadening chemical sprayed by the Holden car factory. Cool's testimony was entirely discredited. 2. The handprint and the scissors. The odontologist's illusion. Experts examined Professor James Cameron's claims. They proved the bloody handprint was simply pareidolia caused by the police carelessly folding the wet fabric. Furthermore, independent textile experts proved that the scissor cuts on the jumpsuit collar contained distinct tufts of fabric consistent with the shearing bite of a canine's carnassial teeth. 3. The trackers validated the ignored experts. Justice Morling brought the Aboriginal trackers, including Nipawin Marty, back to the stand. He validated their original 1980 testimony. They had tracked the dingo. They had seen the drag marks. The police's urban bias had caused them to ignore the most accurate forensic evidence available on the night of the tragedy. Justice Morling's final report was a devastating indictment of the police, the forensic experts, and the media. He concluded that not only was there no evidence to support a murder charge, but the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to exactly what Lindy had said on night one. A dingo had taken her baby. In September 1988, the Northern Territory Court of Criminal Appeals officially quashed all convictions against Lindy and Michael Chamberlain. They were legally, undeniably innocent. You might think the story ends there. A wrong righted. A family compensated by the government. A dark chapter closed. But trauma does not respect court rulings. The psychological wreckage left behind by the witch hunt was immense. The stress of the trial, the prison sentence, and the relentless public scrutiny shattered Lindy and Michael's marriage. In 1991, they divorced. Michael would spend the rest of his life writing books and fighting to clear his daughter's name completely, profoundly haunted by the injustice until his death in 2017. And then there was the culture. Legal exoneration does not instantly erase public prejudice. For decades, the phrase, "the dingo's got my baby," remained a cruel, ubiquitous punchline in pop culture. It was mocked on Seinfeld, parodied on late-night television, and used as a casual joke by millions of people who had no idea they were laughing at a mother's horrific trauma. A Hollywood film, A Cry in the Dark, starring Meryl Streep as Lindy, helped shift the global narrative toward sympathy, but the casual cruelty of the public to dangers to fade. And there was one final, painful administrative insult. Despite the convictions being quashed in 1988, Azaria's official death certificate remained an open wound. The previous coroners had left the cause of death officially unknown. Lindy Chamberlain wanted the truth stamped in ink. She wanted the government to admit, legally, exactly what killed her daughter. On June 12, 2012, a fourth and final coronial inquest was held in Darwin. Coroner Elizabeth Morris sat at the bench. Lindy, now in her 60s, her hair grey but her posture just as rigid and fortified as it was in 1980, sat in the front row. Michael sat nearby. Coroner Morris read her findings aloud. She noted that in the 3 decades since Azaria's death, the terrifying reality of the outback had proven Lindy right over and over again. There had been dozens of documented, horrific dingo attacks on children across Australia, including fatal ones. The wild dogs were, undeniably, capable apex predators. Coroner Morris looked down at the official death certificate. She signed her name. Cause of death: attacked and taken by a dingo. Then, the coroner did something extraordinary. In a legal system defined by cold, procedural detachment, she looked directly at the Chamberlain family. Her voice cracked, heavy with the weight of 32 years of institutional failure. Please accept my sincere sympathy on the death of your special and loved daughter and sister, Azaria. I am so sorry for your loss. Time does not remove the pain and sadness of the death of a child. Lindy Chamberlain walked out of the courthouse that day, clutching the amended death certificate. She addressed the media, the same media machine that had once tried to destroy her. She was not bitter. She was victorious. The Chamberlain case changed Australia forever. It forced a massive, systemic overhaul of forensic science protocols. It revolutionized how crime scenes are managed. But most importantly, it left behind a brutal, enduring lesson about the dangers of media trials, confirmation bias, and the weaponization of public opinion. Society demanded that a mother perform her grief in a specific, theatrical way. When she refused, society decided she was a monster. If you ever stand at the base of Uluru today, as the sun sets and the rock turns a deep, bruising red, listen to the wind moving through the spinifex grass. It carries the weight of a history that should never be forgotten. It is a reminder that nature is wild, unpredictable, and entirely indifferent to human life. But it is also a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't hiding in the dark desert night. Sometimes they are sitting in a courtroom, staring right at you.